Why might shelters and rescues describe a dog in one way, and then once the dog settles into the new home, they behave in a totally different way? A lot of times, folks will think that the rescue or the shelter lied to them about the dog. And while I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, there's often a much less malicious reason. And that is that behavior is contextual. What that means is that behavior changes based on the context, even if the emotions are the same. So if I have a dog who is living in a shelter, it is stressful, it's noisy, their sleep is disrupted, they have very little agency, potentially they have very little access to having their needs satiated appropriately. That might put the dog into a freeze state. Their nervous system is so overwhelmed by what's happening that they go into what in humans we might think of as dissociation. We can't ask dogs if they dissociate, but I think that's a helpful illustration for what a functional freeze state is. And the thing is, a functional freeze state is often mistaken for the dog being totally fine. I don't want you picturing here that dog that's huddled in the back of the corner and physically not moving, although that certainly also happens. These might be dogs who are moving, but they're not curious, they're not problem solving, they're not engaging in pro-social behaviors, and their stress levels are through the roof. But you're not going to see physiological signs of stress in these dogs like panting and big eyes. They're in a hypo-aroused state. And so now this dog is believed to be fine. And potentially, as we're seeing how this dog reacts to things around them, because they're in that freeze state, they seem fine. Fine with kids, fine with noises, fine with other dogs, fine with people. And then the dog goes home and they start to come out of that freeze state. They're like off the stress scale here, and they start to come back down into fight, flight, fawn, fidget, more active coping happening in the limbic system instead of the hindbrain. And then come back down more. And we start to see a clearer representation of how they're feeling. Maybe they were always scared of kids or other dogs or strangers, but it looked like a freeze state, so they looked fine. And now it looks like a fight response, or it looks like a flight response, or it looks like a fawn or fidget response. Or maybe I have a dog who, in the shelter setting where they didn't know anyone and they weren't surrounded by anyone that they knew or trusted, and they were a bit overwhelmed by things, they chose flight. They would move away. And now that they're settled into a home and there is some predictability and routine, and they've formed some safe relationships, and they have places that are safe for them, which are good for well-being, but now maybe they are more likely to choose a fight response. And that could just mean that the dog goes from, cowering back to giving a growl. It can still be very appropriate. It doesn't have to mean like that we're up at the level of like biting. But my point is that depending on context, one's behavior changes. And humans are the same way. All mammals are the same way. When you feel more comfortable expressing yourself, you might present very differently than a situation where you feel nervous or shy or completely overwhelmed. The other piece of this is that it can be sometimes difficult to get data on all of the things. So sometimes when a rescue or shelter says good with kids, they're not basing that on the data of like the dog interacting with like a myriad of different children with different behaviors and different comfortability with dogs and different dog skills and different attentiveness and intervention by parents, and getting a full scope in that way. Sometimes they just mean this dog isn't mouthy, they don't jump, they don't resource guard. Sometimes it's more an absence of behaviors that checks the box as good with kids. Now, this is nothing against shelter or rescue dogs. I'm not trying to discourage people from adopting shelter or rescue dogs. I love shelter and rescue dogs. And as someone who specializes in working with aggressive behavior and nervous system dysregulation, I see shelter dogs, I see dogs from rescues, I see purebred dogs who came home at 8 weeks from the breeder. A responsible breeder. It happens. Because there are so many factors that impact behavior and that can lead to a dysregulated nervous system in dogs. There's genetics, there's early environment, there's learning history, there's health. But this is important to understand because behavior can change so contextually. One thing that can help is to understand how to differentiate between a dog that's in a functional freeze state and a dog who's genuinely fine. We can learn to look at data points like behavior and body language, certainly, but also, is the dog's digestive system online? Are they curious? Are they problem solving? Do they seem to be processing information? There are some situations where there are deal breaker behaviors. I need a dog who's good with kids. Or, for folks who have maybe had to make a very difficult decision recently, like behavioral euthanasia, and they are very apprehensive about getting another dog. Or a myriad of other situations where you might really, really need a good understanding of this dog. There are a couple of things that we can do. One is foster to adopt. And so it can be really helpful to foster the dog for a while. And a lot of rescues and shelters will support this path. And you foster the dog. And that can just emotionally be a little easier if things don't work out. So the dog is in the home, they're decompressing. Ideally, we're doing this for several weeks. Sometimes there are limitations on the amount of time you can foster, but folks in rescue and shelter worlds will have heard of the rule of 3. Around 3 days, 3 weeks, and 3 months, we tend to see significant behavior shifts as the dog gets more comfortable. And sometimes that means that behaviors we thought were going to be a problem actually aren't. And sometimes it means that the dog's distress about something or their fear of something or whatever the case might be actually becomes more apparent. Now, an ethical shelter or rescue will take the dog back either way, but sometimes having that foster to adopt versus just adopting and then making the decision to return the dog, especially due to the stigma that can be placed on returning a dog or rehoming a dog, even when it's best for everyone involved, including the dog. Sometimes that is an easier transition, and it gives everyone a chance to get to know each other a bit, which makes a lot of sense to me. Why would we be rushing into this decision? Just because your dogs do well at a meet and greet in the shelter does not mean that they are going to enjoy living together. And just because you say a nice hello to someone at a coffee shop does not mean you want them to be your roommate. Another option, and this can be used in tandem with the foster to adopt option, is to consider dogs who are already in foster homes. When you consider adopting a dog who is in foster, you're adopting a dog who has been living in a home environment. And so if we think about how behavior is contextual, they might have a much better idea of how that dog is genuinely in the real world, in real life, than a dog who's living in a shelter environment. And, this goes the other way, too. There are often dogs in shelter environments who are losing their bananas. They do not present well. And it's because they're really having a bad time. But then in a household environment, when their stress levels are lower, their needs are satiated, they have a better sense of predictability and routine and safe people and safe spaces, those behavior concerns go away. So this goes both directions. But when a dog is in a home environment, we might have better data. And this is why, too, if you bring home a dog to adopt and it doesn't work out, whether that's through foster or for other reasons, you've adopted them and you need to return them, it's still incredibly valuable, one, for them to get a break from the shelter. Studies have shown that even a few hours out, a weekend out, that sort of thing is helpful to the sheltered dogs. And you are now arming the rescue or shelter with more information about how the dog does in a home environment. And of course, we want to hedge that with, again, how long was the dog there? What is the context? And connecting with a shelter or rescue that has a good understanding of behavior in that way can also be really, really helpful. But I don't want to discourage people from adopting from their county shelter, their kill shelter. Let it be known that kill shelters are often just shelters that receive very little funding. They are shelters who are open admission, meaning they have to take everything that comes through their door, and they may have to euthanize for space or behavior or medical issues, versus a no-kill shelter, which is generally a shelter that pulls dogs from other places. They get to hand select those dogs, and they do still euthanize for behavior and medical, just not for space. Or at least they do if they're ethical. So that's sort of, I could make a separate video on any one of these topics, but that is kind of like a 10-minute look at why behavior might appear so different. It doesn't mean someone was malicious. Behavior is contextual.